In this episode, I want to share with you one of the most remarkable stories in all of church history that hardly anyone even knows about. The next book in our series on the mystics is The Spiritual Guide by Michael Molinos, who was a 15th century mystic. To give you an idea of what I mean by remarkable, there have been more copies of this book burned than any other book published in Christian history. On the front of the book it reads, "Anyone found in possession of this book will be excommunicated. Papal Decree 1687. So powerful was this book's influence on Europe that within 6 years of its release, it had been translated into every language in Western Europe. Now, the primary teaching of this book is a type of inward prayer which came to be known as quietism. Quietism is essentially a very beautiful art or form of the contemplative prayer style. Now, it was documented that in Naples, Italy alone, over 20,000 people had begun meeting in small groups to begin teaching and discussing the type of inward prayer taught in the Spiritual Guide. And so just from what little I've shared, I'm sure you can already guess where the story's headed. The fact is that this incredible saint, who almost no one even knows about, came closer to reforming the Catholic Church than any other single person in church history. But he ended up being sealed off in a dungeon and killed in prison by the Catholic Church. So controversial was this figure that even today, the Vatican will not release the transcripts of his secret trial in which he was condemned as a heretic by the Church. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. The heretic who almost changed church history, Michael Molinos and the Spiritual Guide. Welcome back to Moving Backwards, episode 16. So our story begins in Western Europe in the year 1670. There was a Spanish priest by the name of Michael Molinos who was incredibly beloved and influential in his community. Now, the only physical description we have of Michael Molinos is he was a man of medium height, fine presence, bright color, black hair, and grave countenance. Now, Michael Molinos was deeply influenced by the two most famous mystics who lived in the 1500s, Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote during the peak of Catholic mysticism. Molinos' teachings attracted a huge following, and he had begun to build an outstanding reputation amongst all the church clergy in Rome as a man of piety. Now, Michael Molinos rose to be the most trusted confessor and clerical leader in all of Rome. And there was a growing movement in Europe during this time, a kind of revival, if you will, in the church, known as quietism, in which prayer was seen as a form of silent meditation or contemplation before God, rather than a long vocal recitation or confession of sins to a priest, which had been the predominant model of prayer up until that time. The term quietism would eventually become synonymous with the word heretic, which I'm sure you could already have anticipated. Anytime something new within the church grows popular enough to challenge the traditional model, it is always met with the full might of religious judgment. Now, Molinos was basically a chapter and verse preacher of Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila, who were also named heretics by the church during their time, and then later named saints. The Catholic Church has a long history of sainting its heretics long after they're killed. Molinos had become so popular that there was a large demand on him to put his teachings into writing. The Spiritual Guide was published in 1675, and it was nothing less than a smash hit. In the next 6 years, it was translated into French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Latin, a feat that no other book could claim. The book received a stamp of approval by well-known scholars, bishops, Jesuits, and cardinals. The Spanish Inquisition itself, which was to later issue a worldwide ban on it, initially declared the book to be, quote, a priceless jewel of piety and perfection. The infamous King Louis XIV sent a representative to Rome before having the book translated into French, named Cardinal d'Estrees. He not only approved of Molinos' teachings, but he widely endorsed him and almost became one of his followers. But remember that name, my friends, because even Jesus himself was betrayed by one of his own disciples. A growing number of priests were adopting Molinos' methods and were advising their people to follow the instructions in the spiritual guide. Many nuns were laying aside their rosaries and other religious devotions to practice this art of inward prayer. Throughout all of Italy, there were unions being formed in homes of those following the teachings from the spiritual guide. So, when does this story get so dark? How did this man in this book become so despised by the church when they were once so loved? Before we return to the story to see what happened, let's take a look at a few passages in this book to see for ourselves. In chapter 5, titled The Limitation of Outward Prayer, he writes, "If you continue on in typical outward prayer, and if such practice continues year after year without a great deal of upward progression, then you are wasting a great deal of time. Why seek the Lord by means of straining the brain, in selecting points to discuss, and in straining to find a God without, when you have Him within you? We simply shall not find our God without, nor shall we find Him by means of reasoning and logic and surface information. Each of us has Him present within us. There seems to be a blindness in those believers who always seek God, cry for Him, long for Him, invoke His name, pray to Him daily, while never discovering that they themselves are a living temple and His one true habitation. The more your outward man delights in some sort of pleasure in prayer, the less delight there is in the Lord. But the less you care for the outward thrills of spiritual things, here is something which delights the Lord." It's no doubt that one of Molinos' greatest threats to the church was his consistent teaching in dying to the egoic nature in order to be transformed into the Christ nature. The church needs to keep you in your egoic identity so that you keep coming back every week. And so this was obviously not a teaching that the church would take kindly to. Now, this is nothing that the other mystics hadn't said before him, but Molinos may have said it in more direct fashion. It's obvious that dying to the false self, or in psychology terms, the conditioned mind, was one of Jesus' main teachings. If any man wishes to be my disciple, let him first die to himself. If any man wishes to save his life, he will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. Now, this is all that Molinos really taught in his book, but where he really trespassed on church territory is when he teaches that all of the outward ordinances, such as Mass, confession, the Rosary, paying indulgences, and so forth, could actually serve as distractions to seeking God. That all of these outward rituals might actually serve to enhance the egoic self by convincing you that these rituals really have anything at all to do with your standing with God. So Molinos wrote that unless these rituals are taken symbolically, then they can actually serve as a hindrance. But knowing God inwardly will only lead to joy. In chapter 21, titled Divine Love, he writes, "Happy is the man who has no other thought but to die to his self-nature. Therein is a victory over the enemy. Yes, but there is also victory over self. In that victory you will find a pure and unadulterated love, and a perfect peace towards your Lord. The believer who leaves all to find the Lord begins to possess all for eternity. There is a great difference which lies between this thing of doing and this thing of dying. Doing is delightful, it belongs to beginners in Christ. Dying belongs to those seeking. Dying to the self belongs to those who are being completed in Christ." So where did the first signs of opposition to Molinos appear? It was in the person of Father Paul Segneri, a barefooted priest who dressed in rags and walked all over Italy denouncing sin. Segneri was a powerful and popular preacher. So powerful was his personality and so eloquent his preaching that when he began to approach a village, the church bells would ring and people would pour out of the town to throw flowers at his feet. He had authored a collection of books and published one titled Harmony Between Effort and Quiet in Prayer. His book appeared in Florence in 1680, exactly 5 years after the Spiritual Guide. Father Segneri was careful not to accuse Molinos of heresy. He spoke highly of the inward life but insisted that this was a type of experience and relationship to God that only a few people could know. He contended that for ordinary people to follow these teachings was to expose them to great risks. Segneri also found something else he objected to. Molinos wrote, "Once you lay aside the first kind of prayer, which is the ritualistic kind, you should never return to it but continue only into the second kind of prayer, contemplation." This, Segneri disagreed with. Segneri's book could not afford to be belligerent, as Molinos was simply too popular for a frontal assault. Just how popular Molinos was can be seen in what happened to poor Paul Segneri after he published his book. He actually lost all his followers. He was treated as if he had been excommunicated. Threatening letters were sent to him, and when he appeared in public, he was received with scorn. But another attack on Molinos was soon to follow. It came in January of 1682 by the Archbishop of Naples, who wrote a letter to the Pope in which he recounted the results of what happens when people follow Molinos' teachings. Those who practiced this form of prayer had given up their rosaries, abandoned their images, including the crucifix, and even given up the daily practice of Mass. Now enter the Jesuits. At last, public opposition had broken out. In the midst of all this, the Spanish Inquisition intervened. They set up a commission in Rome to look into the writings of Molinos and Segneri. What was Molinos teaching? What was quietism? Was this free will or grace? In 1682, the commission assembled. They read both books in question, examined them carefully, and, if you can believe it, the book by Segneri was condemned. The book by Molinos was pronounced by the Inquisition to be, quote, in agreement with the faith of the Church and with Christian morality. Because Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross were also Spanish mystics, their teachings were not all that widespread in France. Therefore, the Jesuits had found some way to instill their own fears into the heart of King Louis XIV. How? It was simple. They tied Molinos to something that Louis hated and feared. Louis XIV was a man easily aroused by the thought of heresy within the Catholic Church. Convince him that something, or anything, smacks of Protestantism, and he was your instant ally. In the year of 1685, the greatest monarch in Europe presented his grievances to the Pope through Cardinal d'Astries. Remember him? He was the French cardinal who had earlier investigated Molinos and his teachings and given him his blessing. Louis expressed his grief that favor had been shown to a heretic, and that there was being tolerated one who taught people to despise the order of services of the Church. And then on July 18th, papal guards were sent to Molinos' house, where he was arrested and thrown into prison. Next, Molinos' home was invaded, and 20,000 letters were found. It is certain that the Jesuits were horrified at their discovery, because among these letters of correspondence was some of the most influential figures in Europe. Either way, every one of those 20,000 letters were burned, and any chance of Molinos' dignification was burned with them. In November of 1685, the Spanish Inquisition officially condemned the spiritual guide. Their inquisitional decree read as follows: "The writings are judged heretical. We have condemned, noted, effaced as heretical, pernicious, erroneous, scandalous, blasphemous, offensive to pious ears, all writings of Miguel de Molinos. We have forbidden each and every one to speak of them, to believe, teach, keep, and practice them." For the next 2 years after Molinos' arrest, very little was heard of him or the controversy. Molinos had simply been swallowed up into oblivion. Proceedings against him began in February 1687. Unfortunately, what took place has been covered in a cloud of obscurity for 300 years. Let it be said that to this day, the Vatican has never published or even allowed anyone to view the record of those proceedings at his trial. No one knows what took place inside those closed meetings. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this situation, there was even pressure applied to the Pope for being examined and tried, as he was also a former friend and ally of Molinos. So you may wonder what Molinos said in his defense at his trials. Interestingly, he refused to speak in his own defense. Once he was arrested, he remained quiet. He simply sat there in silence, a testimony to his own teachings. Take everything that enters your life with total acceptance and as from the hand of God. It was his conviction about being indifferent to life's ups and downs that held him in silence. On the 28th day of August 1687, an official decree was posted by the Inquisition declaring Molinos guilty of having taught godless doctrines and having practiced them. What followed is one of those moments in church history that's almost a comedy of justice. The Inquisition set aside a day to make itself look good. It was decided that Molinos' renunciation of his heresy would be officially celebrated with all of the pomp and glamour that the church was capable, and it was capable of a lot. The church even issued a proclamation stating that any person attending this ceremony would be given 15 years of indulgences. And on that appointed day, the cardinals and bishops and royalty and ambassadors all assembled together with a crowd of tens of thousands of people. Molinos was dramatically led before the expectant mass of people. At 65 years old, he stood before them, attired in the garment of a heretic, his hands and feet shackled and holding a burning torch. A cardinal mounted the pulpit and read aloud the charges against him, which took several hours. The crowd became so infuriated at hearing all that was charged against him that they began crying out, "To the flames! To the flames!" Following the reading came the pronouncement of judgment. Molinos was to be sentenced to life imprisonment. As he walked towards his cell, he paused momentarily at its threshold. What took place next is one of those rare and golden moments in history. An instant flash of insight into an otherwise almost unknown personality. Long after any chance where he could have saved himself, at the last possible moment, Molinos broke his silence. And in fact, Molinos is remembered more for these last 20 seconds standing in front of the prison door than for the rest of his life combined. And it was in this last moment that his true heart and character are revealed to us. And these were his exact words. "Goodbye, Father. We shall meet again on the day of judgment. Then it will be seen if the truth was on your side or mine." So, what can we learn from this story? There seems to be a valuable lesson here that wants to be told. The question is, why does religion always persecute people who find God outside the boundaries of their doctrines and rituals? Why does it always persecute those who find God not in the superficial things, but in the depths? As we all know, you do not attack what you're not threatened by. And in this story, it's obvious that the Roman Catholic Church locked Molinos away not because they actually believed his work was heretical, but because up until the Jesuits launched their campaign against him, all of the church clergy and the people and even the Pope himself were huge fans of Molinos' work, a work that challenged the very fabric of religious control. See, religion always pretends like the interior life is all well and good with them, until that interior life comes between them and their power and control. Make no mistake, the institution exists for no one but itself. This is why the church has such a rich history of persecuting and killing holy men and women when they're alive, and then later sainting them once they're dead. As someone once said, religion stones you when you're wrong and crucifies you when you're right. No system or organization can ever possess God or claim any authority for him. So anytime that you blindly follow any system or institution, you are guaranteeing yourself to be led into deception. But following your heart will never lead you astray. The fact is this: you are either a servant of the Spirit or a prisoner of the organization. Church is great and very beneficial when it's done correctly, but over the course of history, the church has committed an untold amount of evils and atrocities in the name of God. How can this be? Because God does not dwell in any system or institution. You are God's true habitation and the throne upon which he sits. This is why Jesus, whenever he healed somebody, never once said, "All right, I've demonstrated my power, now come and join my religion." Jesus did not come to start a religion, but to show that religions aren't necessary because you have God within you already. And how can you make a religion out of that? You could go to every church service that's ever existed, but if you do not eventually turn inwards, then you would never find God in any of them. And many mystics and saints have pointed to this truth throughout history, like Michael Molinos, even to their own demise. But they did it because they had found something so real, something so perfect and holy within themselves, that they could not keep silent about it. So I ask you then, which person has the greater truth? The one who persecutes another because of their fear of losing power, or the person who accepts persecution upon themselves because of their inner conviction? I'll let you be the judge. But one thing cannot be denied, that what this book teaches was so captivating to the people of his age, a people who were steeped in religious orthodoxy, that it gave them something to live for again, and even something to die for. This book showed people a path to knowing God that did not require slavery to a religious institution, but through direct experience alone, something that's still missing in many of our churches today. So I would urge you not only to read this book, but to take up this inward way of quiet prayer, of laying aside all outward strivings and retreating inwards to the place where God truly dwells, not only for yourself, but in honor of all those who've come before you, who sacrificed everything in order to know Christ in the depths.